The fluorescent lights flickered ominously as I walked down the silent corridor of St. Agnes Hospital. It was past midnight, and the usual hustle and bustle of the day had long given way to an eerie stillness that seemed to seep into my bones. Working the night shift was never easy, but tonight felt different, as if the building itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. I was on my rounds, checking in on patients and making sure everything was in order. Each room I entered was dimly lit. The only sound was the soft hum of medical equipment. As I approached Mr. Johnson's room, a chill ran down my spine for no apparent reason. I hesitated for a moment before pushing open the door. Inside, the room was freezing cold despite the warm summer night outside. Mr. Johnson lay motionless in his bed, hooked up to various monitors that beeped rhythmically. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickly finished my checks and left the room, closing the door behind me with a sense of relief. As I continued down the corridor, a strange noise echoed from the end of the hall. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, but there was no one else around. My heart began to race as I picked up my pace, my footsteps echoing louder than ever in the empty hallway. Suddenly, the lights above me started to flicker erratically, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I tried to remain calm, telling myself it was just a power surge, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper coming from behind me. "Help me." I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, I turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out before me, the lights now steady once more. I tried to brush it off as exhaustion playing tricks on my mind, but as I continued down the corridor, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. It was as if the hospital itself was haunted, filled with restless spirits that lingered in the darkness. When I reached the nurse's station, I found Sarah, the night nurse, sitting with a troubled expression. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded slowly. "I've been hearing things all night. Whispers, footsteps. It's like the hospital is alive tonight." I couldn't help but agree. Something was terribly wrong, and whatever it was seemed to be getting closer. We decided to stick together, hoping that safety could be found in numbers. As we made our way through the labyrinthine corridors, the atmosphere grew thicker with each passing moment. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the air grew colder with each step. We checked on more patients, all seemingly asleep, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the silence, echoing through the hospital like a gunshot. Sarah and I exchanged terrified glances before running toward the source of the sound. It led us to the basement, an area rarely visited at night, filled with old equipment and storage rooms. The scream echoed again, louder this time, and we burst into the dimly lit basement. There, in the far corner, we saw a figure huddled on the ground. It was Mr. Johnson, his eyes wide with terror as he pointed a trembling finger at something behind us. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. In the shadows, I saw a dark silhouette, a figure that shouldn't have been there, that was undeniably real. Its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light, and its presence seemed to suck the air from the room. Sarah and I stood frozen in fear, unable to comprehend what we were seeing. The figure moved closer, its footsteps echoing like a death knell in the silence. With a surge of adrenaline, we turned and ran, racing up the stairs and back into the main hospital. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the nurse's station, where we barricaded ourselves in and called security. When they arrived, we tried to explain what had happened, but our words seemed to fall on deaf ears. There was no sign of the figure in the basement, no evidence of what we had witnessed. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home from that hospital, something dark and malevolent. I quit my job soon after, unable to set foot in St. Agnes Hospital without feeling a cold shiver down my spine. To this day, I still don't know what Sarah and I encountered that night, and I'm not sure I want to. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, lurking in the shadows where they belong. The night shift at Crescent Valley Hospital always had a surreal quality to it, but one autumn evening pushed the boundaries of what I believed possible. I was stationed in the emergency department, a flurry of activity during the day, but eerily quiet after midnight. The clock struck 2 a.m. when a call came through from the psychiatric ward. A patient, Mr. Thompson, was causing a disturbance, claiming he saw things that weren't there. I hurried up to the 5th floor, the dimly lit hallway casting long shadows that seemed to dance with every flicker of the overhead lights. As I approached Mr. Thompson's room, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, a feeling of unease settling in my gut. Entering the room, I found Mr. Thompson sitting on his bed, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at a corner of the room. "They're here," he muttered, voice trembling. "The shadows. They're watching me." I tried to calm him, to assure him it was just his imagination. But as I glanced towards the corner he pointed to, I saw nothing. Just darkness. Mr. Thompson's paranoia persisted, though. He spoke of whispers in the air, of figures that moved just beyond his line of sight. His fear was palpable, infecting the air around us like a thick fog. As the night wore on, strange occurrences began to unfold throughout the hospital. Lights flickered incessantly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Nurses reported hearing footsteps echoing in deserted hallways, even though no one was there when they investigated. In the ICU, a patient coded suddenly, despite being stable just moments before. Doctors and nurses rushed to save them, but the atmosphere was tense, heavy with a sense of foreboding. By the time I returned to the emergency department, my nerves were frayed. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, each hour bringing with it a new sense of unease. Around 4 a.m., I was called to room 317, a room that had been vacant for weeks due to renovations. The call came from the night security guard, Tom, a stoic man who rarely showed fear. "John, you need to see this," Tom said, his voice tight with apprehension. I followed him down the dimly lit corridor to room 317. The door creaked open ominously, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. Inside the room, the air was freezing, a stark contrast to the warmth of the hospital's heating system. Frost covered the walls in intricate patterns, shimmering in the pale light of the moon filtering through the window. But the most unsettling sight was in the center of the room, a circle of salt, meticulously poured in a perfect ring on the floor. "What the hell?" I breathed, my voice barely a whisper. Tom shook his head, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. "I found it like this when I did my rounds. No one's been in here all night." The chill settled over me, the realization sinking in that something beyond explanation was happening at Crescent Valley Hospital. The circle of salt, a ward against malevolent spirits and folklore, spoke volumes about the depth of fear that had gripped the hospital. As the night dragged on, the hospital felt increasingly like a battleground between the living and the unknown. Whispers echoed through empty corridors, and shadows seemed to move with a purpose of their own. Every step I took felt like tiptoeing through a minefield of the supernatural. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The first rays of sunlight spilled through the windows, dispelling the shadows and casting a semblance of normalcy over the hospital. Yet, the events of that night haunted me long after the sun rose. Crescent Valley Hospital had always been a place of healing, but that night had shown me its darker side. Place where the veil between reality and the paranormal was dangerously thin. Years later, I still wonder about that night, about the mysteries that lurk in the quiet corners of every hospital. Some experiences defy explanation, leaving an indelible mark on those who bear witness. Crescent Valley Hospital taught me that not all hauntings are confined to abandoned buildings or ancient ruins. Sometimes they unfold in the most unexpected of places, unsettling our understanding of the world and reminding us of the thin line between sanity and madness. The night shift at Mercy Falls General Hospital was a world unto itself, a realm where the boundaries between life and death blurred, and where the flickering lights cast long, unsettling shadows down empty corridors. I had been a nurse there for 5 years, and every shift brought its own challenges. But one night in particular stands out, a night when the hospital itself seemed to turn against us. It was a stormy October evening, rain drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. The clock had just struck midnight when a call came from the psychiatric ward. Ms. Daniels was in distress, claiming she saw a figure standing at the end of her bed, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. I hurried down the echoing hallways, my footsteps echoing hollowly against the linoleum floor. The hospital was quieter than usual. Patients and staff alike tucked away in their rooms, sheltered from the storm raging outside. Entering Miss Daniels' room, I found her sitting up in bed, eyes wide with terror as she stared at a spot in the corner. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "The man with the glowing eyes." I glanced towards the corner she indicated, but saw nothing except the shifting shadows cast by the flickering bedside lamp. I tried to calm her, to reassure her that it was just her imagination playing tricks, but her fear was infectious. As I turned to adjust the lamp, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the light with a sharp hiss. Miss Daniels let out a strangled cry, clutching the blankets tightly to her chest. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as a chill settled over the room, the air thick with an unnatural coldness. I fumbled for the light switch, but before I could find it, the lamp flickered back to life, casting a feeble glow over the room. Miss Daniels' fear persisted throughout the night, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if expecting the spectral visitor to reappear at any moment. I stayed with her for as long as I could, checking her vitals and offering words of comfort. But the atmosphere remained tense and charged with an unspoken dread. As the night wore on, strange events began to unfold throughout the hospital. Lights flickered erratically, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Nurses reported hearing whispers echoing through deserted hallways, voices that spoke in hushed tones just beyond the threshold of understanding. In the pediatric ward, toys inexplicably turned on by themselves, their cheerful melodies warped into haunting tunes that sent shivers down the spines of staff and parents alike. In the maternity ward, a new mother claimed to have seen a woman in white hovering over her newborn's crib, her expression serene yet somehow unnerving. As the hours dragged on, the hospital felt increasingly like a battleground between the living and the unknown, a place where the veil between reality and the supernatural was dangerously thin. Each step I took felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath me held secrets that threatened to engulf me whole. Around 3 a.m., a call came from the basement, a part of the hospital rarely visited at night except by maintenance staff. The voice on the other end was frantic, barely coherent, speaking of a presence that lurked in the darkness, its intentions unknown and its presence palpable. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the bowels of the hospital, the concrete walls closing in around me like the jaws of a predator. The air grew colder with each step, a tangible reminder of the unseen forces that surrounded me. When I reached the basement, I found the maintenance worker, Mr. Johnson, pale and trembling. He pointed towards a storage room at the end of the corridor, a room that had been sealed off for renovations months ago. I heard footsteps, Mr. Johnson whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning units. Footsteps and whispers. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, before cautiously approaching the storage room. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight whole. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile cleanliness of the hospital above. As I stepped further into the room, my flashlight illuminated rows of dusty shelves and discarded equipment, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. But it was the far corner of the room that caught my attention, a corner bathed in an unnatural darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that I was not alone in the darkness. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, the air growing thick with an oppressive weight that pressed down on my chest. Whispers filled the room, indistinct yet unmistakably present, their voices rising and falling in a haunting cadence. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my ears, before turning and fleeing from the basement as if pursued by unseen hands. The hospital seemed to blow around me, its walls closing in with every step, until I burst through the basement door and into the comparative safety of the hallway. When dawn finally broke, casting its golden light through the windows, I found myself trembling with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The night had been a harrowing journey into the unknown, a testament to the fragile boundary between the tangible and the unseen.